to Sergey Shuvaev. And Sergey is at Cold Spring Harbor. I believe he just finished his PhD in October. He's interested in applying computational methods to neuroscience using reinforcement learning and deep learning, and wants to know how such behaviors are computed in the brain. And he'll be talking about motivation. So, Sergey.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is a joint work with Tumit Tran, Marcus Stevenson-Jones, Bo Lee, and Alex Kulikov at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. And without further ado, I want to start with what do we mean by motivation and why we are interested in it. So we all agree that same reward can be perceived differently depending on the circumstances. And for an example, I want to show this coffee cup. If somebody thinks about a cup of coffee in the morning, then it's definitely rewarding. It can help us wake up and start off a day. So it's a positive reward. If you think about a cup of coffee closer to the night, then it can derail our night sleep, so maybe not as good. If you're still looking at a cup of coffee at the daytime, but you already had one, maybe it's already too much, so likely it's also a negative reward. So what you can see here is that the same physical object, namely cup of coffee, may be perceived largely differently depending on the circumstances. And the circumstances we would refer to as motivational salience. So this would normally include things like thirst, hunger, fatigue, and so on. And they can be combined in a motivation vector mu, which describes how much you want each of the rewards. And so then a value of a perceived reward would be a function of this vector mu. So since the differences in perception of reward would guide our behaviors, it is interesting to study motivation. Now, correlates of motivations has been observed in the brain, particularly in a structure called ventral pallidum. And here is an experiment which I think very nicely illustrates it. So lab rats, they normally do not like salt. But if you keep them on a salt-free diet for a long time, then eventually salty water can become rewarding for them. And we can see the results in line with that in the activations of ventral pallidum. So if salt is presented to normal control rats, there is no activation. But if salty water is presented to salt-deprived rats, then we see a burst of activity here. As a control to that, we know that rats like sugar, so both control and salt-deprived rats can be introduced to sweet water, and there we will see a burst of activity in both experiments, suggesting that it's either specific to salt or sugar. So we want to use this and other results to make biologically plausible models of motivation, and want to explore these models as in how the behaviors in this model occur. So to illustrate our approach, please consider the following example, which we call the 4-demands task. An agent, which is a dot here, navigates in a 4-room environment, and every room is associated with a certain type of a reward. So in the first room, an agent can drink some water, in the second room get some food, third room get some sleep, fourth room play a game. Now, the color coding here reflects the motivation of the agent towards each of the resources, with yellow being low motivation and green being high motivation. So the motivation in our models works in the following way. If the agent is in a room and consumes a reward, then motivation to this resource drops to 0. When the agent leaves the room and do not consume this goods anymore, the motivation grows linearly as a function of time until it saturates at the plateau. We define the perceived reward of an agent in this model as a product between a physical reward, like water, food, or something, by a motivation towards this reward. And the goal of the agent in our task is to maximize the average reward intake over time. So when we talk about maximizing rewards by choosing certain actions, the reinforcement learning is often used. And the brief idea of a reinforcement learning is that an agent maintains a function which is an estimate of the discounted future rewards. In our case, it's perceived rewards, so motivations multiplied by rewards. And as such, this function, which is called a Q function, depends on three parameters. So it's a state of an agent, namely its position in the environment, its motivation of the agent, and it's an action. So this makes the input space of a function multidimensional. So we decided to use deep neural networks as a functional approximator. On the input, our deep neural network would receive the state of agent, namely a 6x6 array, same as environment size. So it's zeros everywhere and 1 in a place where the agent is positioned. And for motivation, water, food, sleep, and play. And the network outputs the sum of expected discounted rewards depending on what action the agent would take right now. And then the agent takes the action which maximizes the Q function. So indeed we can show that our model learns the optimal behavior in this task, namely going in the circles. And it is because when an agent gets some water in water room, while it goes through 3 hours room, the first grows until its maximal value. So when the agent is back to the water room and drinks, then it gets a maximum reward. This was the one example of motivation schedule, but they can be different and can lead to different behaviors, including like models of addiction. So in this model, the motivations to water, sleep, and playing games saturate at a value of 1, whereas motivation in what we call a smoking room can go all the way up to 10. And what we observe here is a pretty well-known behavior where an agent just spends some time next to a smoking room, and eventually when the motivation for smoking grows up enough, goes and has a smoke. So this way the models of motivation can be used to give another interpretation for behaviors such as addiction. Now, what I was talking about so far were like purely computational models, and although they were based on prior results in psychology and neuroanatomy, it would be nice to see some parallels between computations in our models and computations in the brain. So to accomplish that, we set up the task for mice. Now, mice were introduced to 2 types of blocks of trials. So in one type of block of trials, which is called motivated trials, the animal was getting a sequence of rewards. So they were of different magnitudes. It could be like a little drop of water, a big drop of water, or like a drop of water could have been emitted, but all of them were rewarding. In another block of trials, which we call unmotivated trials, there were only punishments. So it could be a strong air puff or a weak air puff or an omitted air puff. And each reward or punishment was preceded by a specific sound tone so that mice would know what to expect. So in this task, we recorded the neural activities in ventral pallidum, which is a part of basal ganglia where the correlates of motivation were observed. And we saw 2 large clusters of the cells in ventral pallidum. So the first cluster of cells we called motivated neurons, and those were responding with higher activations to the rewards, color-coded red here, and with decreased activations to punishments, color-coded blue. In another cluster, which we call unmotivated neurons, the trend was the opposite. So to see if it compares to our models, we built a model of this task in our motivation framework. And what we saw that in model, we observed 2 very similar clusters of the neurons. Now, moreover, in our neural network model, we could look at the weights and between the neurons. And what we observed that within each class of neurons, so within motivated neurons and unmotivated neurons, there was a strong positive weights within the cluster and strong negative weights across the clusters. This is commonly known as a push-pull circuit, and the scheme is here. The idea is that motivated neurons get a cue that a reward is going to come soon, it transmits this knowledge to the unmotivated neuron. And then on the next time iteration, it gets back to motivated neurons. And this knowledge stays in a loop until the actual reward comes. This is very similar to the model of working memory, and it, for example, could be in a prefrontal cortex, which projects its inputs to reward system. To summarize, I want to say that deep reinforcement learning networks with motivation generate biologically plausible behaviors and neural activity. They do adapt to changing demands without relearning the task. And a couple of things I didn't have time to cover, but they can be used to implement hierarchical reinforcement learning, and they may help to infer motivation dynamics from behavior. So if you're interested in these latter points, we have a preprint, very same title, Neural Networks with Motivation on arXiv. And with that, I want to thank my collaborators, Tumit Tran, Marcus Stevenson, John Boley, and Alex Kulikov. And I want to thank you all for your attention.
Very nice, Sergey. So, the ventral pallidum is more in the frontal cortex, and how do you see this as it's obviously part of the planning part of the brain, but the question is, dopamine neurons are found also in substantia nigra pars compacta, which project to the back of the brain. Do you see them as different and separate in terms of motivation?
I think, so the thing is that our neural network model so far is kind of modeling the entire reward system, because it receives the inputs from the task, and it has to output actions. So currently within our model, it's difficult to distinguish between the exact parts. That could be an interesting future direction, I think, and we have some prior data about that. For instance, Marcus Stevenson, John, and Boley in their 2020 paper show that there might be little to no recurrent connectivity in ventral pallidum, so that can make more clues as of how our recurrent network model would map on the reward system. Let's say that ventral pallidum would be more feed-forward projections, and the push-pull circuit could be closer to the inputs of a reward system, such as prefrontal cortex. But so far, it would be difficult to separate much further.
Okay, very good. Here comes a question from Sam Blakeman. I might have missed it, but how did you model the motivational variables, mu? Did they just decrease exponentially? I guess they could follow more complex trajectories and perhaps even interact.
I like that question. So in our task, the growth was linear until it was plateauing at a certain threshold, which we call theta here, and then they would drop just immediately. And this was kind of the simplest schedule we could come up with, because it relates to what we know about motivational drives as described in Neil Miller's book. So that we grow till some point and then saturate, and then like linear growth would be the simplest model. But yeah, definitely there could be different motivational schedules and different behaviors depending upon them. And one example is that we can make this threshold larger or smaller, and it already would result in different optimal behaviors. Another example would be the addiction example, which is so far pretty cartoonish, where one of the motivation grows much higher than the other's one. But I think it will be a really interesting next step to try to maybe plug in more meaningful motivation, maybe with different growth constants or like different thresholds. And in everything we are working on now, we are working on a hierarchical reinforcement learning model to infer motivation from behaving agents. So probably that would be like in line with this question, when we will have more clues about the more realistic dynamics of motivational salience.
Good. One last question from Elena Zizikova. How much data are required to learn a behavioral strategy?
So in our models, we simulate the data, so we kind of can use the infinite data. I think we use something around 3 to the 10 to the 5th iterations. So we didn't really optimize it for smaller amounts of data, but I would imagine that with modern reinforcement learning techniques such as memory replay and the others, it can be also kind of shrunk. Also, I can't help but thinking a lot that these models, they learn the task in isolation, and it is in line with the previous talks. Mouse are like human. They do not live in isolation. They already know how to extract the important features from the data or from like naturalistic images from the surrounding world. So I would imagine if it is done in a framework of curriculum learning and something like that, then with some pre-existing knowledge, then learning of a task itself may become much shorter.
Okay, Sergey, thank you so much. Great.
Thank you.